Everyone wants to fight for this title of the best diet for insulin resistance, the best diet for prediabetes, best diet for diabetes, when in reality, maybe the answer has just been in front of us all along, and it's just been a common denominator throughout a lot of good diets. We need to do a deep dive into understanding whether carbs are going to be the thing we need to remove, or maybe increasing protein is the thing we need to add, because the studies are nuancing. If you're not careful, you're going to form a weird opinion that might be a little bit skewed. So let's go ahead and jump right into this. We got a lot of data to cover, but we're going to come out with a pretty interesting answer and also some really awesome stuff just to arm ourselves with. I learned some stuff when I was researching this as well. First thing we have to look at is a study that's published in the journal Nutrients that took a look at the effect of a high protein compared to a moderate protein diet on non-diabetic individuals, because things are different with diabetics, right? But on non-diabetics, we can learn some stuff too. What they did is they had subjects go on 10 days of a high protein Mediterranean diet compared to a moderate carb, moderate protein style Mediterranean diet. So it was 55% carbohydrates, 20% protein, and 25% fat for the moderate group. And it was 40% carbohydrates, 30% protein, and 20% fat for the higher protein group. Now with all the groups, they put them in a 500 calorie deficit. So either way, they were going to lose weight, they were in an equal deficit. Results were quite interesting. The high protein group ended up having significant improvements in glycemic control and significant improvements in insulin resistance. Now, when you look at this, you say, well, that's a no-brainer. That's because they restricted carbohydrates. They replaced carbohydrates with protein. Interesting, and definitely makes sense, because carbohydrates in excess are definitely a problem with insulin resistance. But maybe we haven't stopped to think that, maybe it's replacing them with protein that's actually doing the trick, or maybe it's a combination of the both. So with that, we have to expand this study a little bit more. And don't worry, I've got more research because we need to vet this out entirely. This same study took a deep dive into the microbiome shifts. Okay, the microbiome shifted dramatically with the high protein diet. And believe it or not, protein does play a pivotal role in how our microbiome is. It's not just about fiber. Protein influences things too. They noticed that there were differences in 10 different species that are associated with glycemic control in the high protein group. So the high protein group had an increase in things like Clostridium and decreases in Lactoclostridium, which is associated with metabolizing choline and some of these other compounds that are directly associated with being precursors to trimethylamine, which is needed for glucose stability. So what this means is it actually decreased the bacteria that impairs glucose tolerance. That's quite interesting. So the microbiome plays a significant role in our glucose management longer term, and protein, not just fiber, plays a role, because there was lower carbs and ultimately lower fiber when you had more protein, yet they still had a positive shift in the gut microbiome. I still stand behind the fact that paying attention to the gut microbiome is one of the most powerful ways to manage glucose in the first place, but maybe that's just my opinion. I also feel like people, if they strategically add the right fibers and the right probiotics, that they can start to model their gut the way that they want. I put a link for the probiotic that I use down below. It's called Seed. There's a 15% off discount link if you use that code Thomas15, using that link that's right there in the top line of the description. So I definitely recommend them. If you're kind of adding a probiotic in, I feel like their technology is just a cut above with the capsule inside of a capsule and combining a prebiotic fiber with a probiotic to create what they call a synbiotic. So if you're getting down to the granular with the microbiome, it's very detailed stuff. And they have tons of literature on their site talking about it. It's not just another fly-by-night probiotic. So that link is down below in the description. Okay, so it still begs the question though, was it the protein or was it the lack of carbs? So let's look at another study. This one was published in the journal Diabetes and actually looked at diabetics. So very interesting. This one took a look at 20% carbohydrates, 30% protein, and 50% fat compared to 55% carbohydrate, 15% protein, and 30% fat. Now this one was called a crossover design, so they switched after a certain amount of time, right? So they got to try both diets. Well, once again, the high protein diet led to a decrease in HbA1c, it led to a decrease in fasting insulin, it led to a decrease in overall fasting glucose. What the heck is going on? But once again, you have a pretty low carb diet alongside the high protein. So we can't tell for certain what is going on here. But what we did start to figure out with the study was that long term, the resting energy expenditure is better in the higher carb group. And when you start looking at even the older ketogenic diet studies, it starts to make you second guess some things. Is it the presence of ketones that were maintaining resting energy expenditure, or were people actually consuming more protein? It varied from study to study. That's obviously not the case. I just raised that as an interesting question, right? Protein maintains resting energy expenditure. So long term, it might allow you to lose weight, maintain body composition, change things, and improve glucose tolerance. Anyhow, let's look at some body composition research here. There was a study that looked at high carb versus high protein versus high fat for 24 weeks with periods of maintenance and caloric restriction. And the results on this were pretty interesting when it came down to body composition. We found that the high fat diets and the high protein diets led to more fat loss. Well, it's starting to look pretty bad for carbohydrates right about now, right? I mean, I don't disagree. Like when you start looking at this data, it does make you question whether high amounts of carbohydrates are the best thing for fat loss or the best thing for insulin resistance. But I try to take an unbiased approach on this. But let's jump into satiety for a second, because this is when I was doing this research where I really got intrigued, because I knew that protein from a mechanical digestion standpoint was really powerful. But wow, this stuff's cool. There's an American Journal of Clinical Nutrition study that took a look at isocaloric high protein diets compared to ad libitum high protein diets. The isocaloric diets, meaning they were given a set number of calories, when they had high protein, they definitely had improvements in satiety, okay? But the ad libitum group, which means they were able to eat as much as they want, but as long as it was a set amount of high protein, right? A percentage of protein, they ended up consuming 441 less calories. That's how satiating high protein was on an ad lib diet. Protein made it so they just consumed 440 less calories. Okay, you do that for about a week, you're gonna be close to losing a pound of fat. But now we look at a really cool study that looked at gut and hunger hormones that was published in the journal Endocrinology and Metabolism. Had subjects overnight fast, and then at 8 a.m., they ate either a high protein breakfast, a high carb breakfast, or a high fat breakfast. They found that the high protein diet suppressed ghrelin levels slowly. Ghrelin's a hunger hormone, suppressed this, and there was no spike afterwards. It suppressed and it gradually came back up. The high carb, and even to a certain degree the high fat diet, crashed ghrelin and then spiked it. So you got an immediate satisfaction, and then you had this increase that came back, big rebound. What the heck? They also saw the same pattern with peptide YY, which is a gut incretin. Saw suppression and kind of gradual response. And then another study took a look at this and found the same kind of patterns with GLP-1. So what we see here is that we're not just satiated because protein takes longer to digest. We're satiated because something is happening with our overall gut hormones too, especially ghrelin. So it's okay to have a crash in ghrelin and be satiated, but what good is that if you're hungry 30 minutes later? All coming down from protein. Of course it's going to affect insulin resistance. But now one of the coolest things that we've learned, we've always been told that when you cut calories, you should increase protein. And that makes sense, but there hasn't been a lot of data to really show us a clear picture of this until this relatively somewhat recent study. So this study was published in the FASEB journal. Very interesting. They divided groups into a group that consumed 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight, 1.6 gram of protein per kilogram, or 2.4 grams of protein per kilogram. 10 days of maintenance calories, followed by 21 days of a 40% deficit. Serious deficit. What they found is that the higher protein groups, the 1.6 and the 2.4, there was no difference in muscle protein synthesis between the maintenance phase and the severe caloric restriction phase. Okay, so all this time we've been thinking that in order to bulk and build muscle, we need to be in this huge caloric surplus, where we found that muscle protein synthesis remains the same in a 40% deficit as it does at maintenance, as long as your protein is high. That means that if you keep your protein high and you reduce calories, doesn't matter what kind of diet you're doing, independent of carbohydrates, independent of ketones, I don't give a care, you will probably maintain muscle decently well as long as you are also combining it with a stimulus. Okay, one more thing. The American Journal of Clinical Nutrition published a paper. I used to think that consuming protein led to about a 15 to 20% increase in the thermogenic effect. This study seems to think that it's more along the lines of 20 to 35% increase in metabolism when you consume protein. That's a huge thermic effect. So I stand behind the fact that maybe the reason that I've had continued success with a ketogenic protocol is because my protein levels remain high. Because I've always had it kind of ingrained in my mind as somewhat of an athlete, at least after I was overweight, that protein is good, it helps me repair. So my ketogenic diets were geared towards higher protein. I put a high protein twist on everything. So what's the takeaway here? I have 1,000,001 different videos on different diets that probably work. But if you have to choose one thing unanimously across the board, high protein. And no, that's not cool right now. I'm not supposed to talk about that, but I think it's cool. I'll see you tomorrow.